The Unbroken Blade, The Legend of Miyamoto Musashi, Part 1, The Child of Silence. The wind carried snow across Harima province on the night Miyamoto Musashi entered the world. It was the spring of 1584, though spring meant little in the highlands, where winter clung to the mountains like a stubborn ghost. Inside a modest dwelling in Miyamoto village, a woman named Omasa labored through the night, her cries swallowed by the howling darkness outside. The midwife's hands moved with practiced urgency, but she knew. She had delivered enough children to recognize when life traded places with death. The infant emerged silent, covered in blood and winter's chill, and Omasa's breathing grew shallow, then ceased. The baby's first breath came not with his mother's joy, but with her absence. They named him Benosuke. His father, Shinmen Munisai, was a master swordsman, a man whose skill with blade and jutei had earned him the title Tenka Muso, without peer in the realm. But skill with a weapon does not teach a man how to hold an infant whose skin burns red with eczema, whose face swells and weeps, whose very appearance speaks of suffering. The child's condition worsened through infancy. His skin cracked and bled. The other children in the village learned to keep their distance, and their parents whispered when Benosuke passed by. He became familiar with isolation before he understood what the word meant. His reflection in still water taught him that he would walk through life marked, that people would always look away first. Munisai tried. For a time he tried to be both father and mother, teacher and comforter, but grief is a hungry thing, and it consumed whatever tenderness remained in the swordsman's heart. The boy reminded him too much of what he had lost. Every rasping breath, every inflamed patch of skin, every moment of the child's existence whispered the same accusation: she died bringing you into the world. The relationship between father and son became a thing of sharp edges. Munisai taught young Benosuke the sword because teaching was what he knew. But where other fathers might offer encouragement, Munisai offered only critique. Where patience might have been given, there was only expectation. The boy learned to move with a blade before he learned to read. He learned to endure pain before he learned to trust. The clash was inevitable. Benosuke was 7 years old when his father's patience finally shattered. The argument began over a failed kata, a sword form that the boy had executed imperfectly. Words escalated. Munisai's hand moved faster than thought, and a short blade whistled through the air, embedding itself in the wall beside the boy's head. For a moment, neither moved. Then Munisai's voice, cold as the mountain wind, delivered the sentence that would define both their lives. "Leave. You are no son of mine." The boy did not cry. He had learned early that tears changed nothing. He gathered what little he owned and walked out into the night, 7 years old, marked by disease, cast out by blood. The path before him led toward the Kamasaka Pass, toward the province of Harima, toward a future written in blade and blood. The pass was not meant for children. It wound through terrain that tested grown men, where one wrong step meant falling into darkness that had no bottom. But Benosuke walked it anyway, because going back was not an option. Going back had never been an option. His feet found purchase on stone made treacherous by ice. His hands gripped rock that cut through cold, numbed skin. He walked through the night and into the next day, driven by a will that would not break even when flesh demanded surrender. When he reached the village of Hirafuku on the other side, he collapsed. An uncle, Dorinbo, found him. The Buddhist monk took in the boy whose father had abandoned him, gave him shelter in the temple, offered him a different kind of teaching. Here Benosuke learned letters and numbers. He learned about the Buddha's teachings on suffering, on attachment, on the impermanence of all things. But more than scripture, he absorbed something else, the understanding that survival was a choice made every morning, and that strength came not from never falling, but from rising every time you fell.
The years in Hirafuku passed. The boy grew taller, stronger, but remained marked by eczema, remained set apart. He trained alone, developing a style that had no name, a ferocity that had no master. By the time he was 13, he had lived more life than most men twice his age. He had known abandonment, isolation, and the long silence of mountains. He had learned that the world gave nothing freely, that respect was taken, not granted, that the only person you could truly rely on was the one staring back from still water. When a samurai named Arima Kihei posted a challenge in the village square, Benosuke, still a child by most measures, removed the notice and wrote his own name across it in rough characters. The samurai's response was predictable: outrage, followed by a demand for public satisfaction. The boy had taken his first step onto a path from which there would be no return. A path measured in drawn blades and stopped hearts. A path walked alone. Part 2. First Blood. The dueling ground in Hirafuku was nothing special. A cleared space between buildings, packed earth marked by countless feet. A crowd gathered, drawn by the spectacle of a warrior's honor being satisfied. They came expecting entertainment. They got an education in violence. Arima Kihei stood in the center, his hand resting on the hilt of his katana with the casual confidence of a man who had faced death and watched it blink first. He was a practitioner of Kashima Shinto Ryu, a school created by Tsukahara Bokuden, one of the legendary swordsmen of the age. He had killed men. He had earned his reputation through blood and steel. Across from him stood a boy, 13 years old, his face mottled with the red patches of eczema, his clothes simple and worn. Benosuke carried a bokken, a wooden practice sword, because no one had seen fit to gift a child with a proper blade. But the way he held it spoke of something the crowd did not expect. There was no nervousness in his stance, no trembling in his grip. His eyes held a stillness that belonged to much older men. A monk attempted to intervene, to explain that this was surely a misunderstanding, that the boy had meant no disrespect. But before diplomacy could work its gentle magic, Benosuke's voice cut through the morning air. "Come on, let's fight!" And then he moved. The attack was sudden, direct, without elegance or finesse. It was the attack of someone who had spent years training alone, who had no master to teach him proper form, who knew only that in combat there were two outcomes: walking away or being carried away. The wooden blade came down in an arc that held all the boy's anger, all his isolation, all the years of being looked away from. Arima reacted, his training reflexive. He drew his short sword and slashed, but the boy was already inside his guard, closer than expected, moving with an instinct that no school had taught him. Benosuke's body twisted, his shoulder driving into the samurai's center of mass, using the man's own momentum against him. They both went down, tangled together in the dust. What happened next was over in seconds. The boy's wooden sword found the samurai's temple with enough force to shatter bone. The crack echoed across the dueling ground, followed by a silence so complete that the crowd could hear the wind moving through the eaves of nearby buildings. Arima Kihei did not rise. Benosuke stood slowly, breathing hard, his clothes covered in dust and the samurai's blood. The crowd stared. The boy who had been invisible, who had been dismissed, who had been cast out by his own father, stood over the body of a renowned warrior. He had killed a man in single combat at 13 years old. In that moment, something changed. Not just in how others saw him, but in how he saw himself. The path forward became clear with a terrible simplicity. This was what he was built for. Not scholarship, not peace, not the quiet life of a monk. Steel and strategy, blood and triumph. This was the language he spoke fluently, the only voice in which the world would listen. 3 years later, at 16, he killed again. The opponent was Tadashima Akiyama, a skillful warrior whose reputation exceeded even Arima's. The details of that duel were simpler. 2 men entered, 1 walked away. Then Osuke walked away. He always walked away. But it was not the victories that defined him in these early years. It was what he did between them. He trained constantly, obsessively, with a focus that bordered on madness. He would practice sword forms until his hands bled, then practice longer still. He studied the movement of water, the flight of birds, the way wind moved through bamboo, understanding that nature itself was the greatest teacher of combat. Flexibility, adaptation, striking from unexpected angles with decisive force. He stopped bathing, a habit that would persist throughout his life. Some said it was because he feared being caught unarmed and vulnerable. Others claimed it was a form of self-mortification, a way of embracing discomfort to strengthen the spirit.
Benosuke never explained. He simply lived as he chose, caring nothing for the opinions of those who would never understand the demands of his chosen path. And always, always he was alone, not because he preferred it, but because the path of the sword permitted no true companionship. To befriend a warrior was to invite the possibility of facing him in combat. To love was to create weakness, a hostage to fortune. The boy who had been abandoned learned to make abandonment his strength, to weaponize isolation, to find power in having nothing that could be taken from him. By the time he turned 20, he had killed multiple opponents and earned a reputation that preceded him like a shadow. But reputation meant nothing. Reputation was air, insubstantial and changing. What mattered was skill, and his skill was still raw, unrefined. A blade that had been tempered but not polished. In 1600, at age 16, history provided the crucible in which that blade would be tested.
Part 3. The Crucible of War. The summer of 1600 burned across Japan like a fever. Two great powers circled each other, gathering allies, preparing for the conflict that would determine the nation's future. On one side stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, the calculating Eastern warlord whose patience had outlasted countless rivals. On the other, Ishida Mitsunari led the Western forces, fighting for the Toyotomi clan and the child heir, Hideyori. The Battle of Sekigahara was not a skirmish. It was not a local dispute. It was the collision of armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, a clash that would echo through the next 2.5 centuries of Japanese history. The outcome would establish the Tokugawa shogunate and usher in the Edo period, transforming Japan from a land of constant warfare to one of enforced peace. Musashi, as he was beginning to be known, found himself drawn into this maelstrom. The historical record debates which side he fought on. Some sources place him with the Western forces under Ukita Hideyeye, while more recent scholarship suggests he may have served under the Kuroda clan with the Eastern Army. What remains undisputed is that he was there, a 16-year-old amid 160,000 warriors, when the fate of Japan was decided, on October 21st, 1600. The battle began in fog so thick that armies stumbled into each other like blind men in a crowded room. The Tokugawa advance guard collided with Ishida's forces at dawn, and what followed was chaos, refined into its purest form. Arquebuses roared, their smoke adding to the morning mist. Arrows fell like rain. Men screamed in a dozen different dialects, called out to gods who seemed to have turned away, and died in the mud without ever seeing who had killed them. Musashi survived because he had learned early that survival was not about bravery. It was about awareness, about reading the flow of battle the way he read the current in a river, finding the pockets of relative safety, moving when movement was possible, holding still when motion meant death. He watched warriors charge into concentrated arquebus fire and get cut down in rows. He saw cavalry charges break against prepared pike formations. He learned that war was not glorious. It was arithmetic written in corpses. The turning point came when Kobayakawa Hideaki, commanding 15,000 men on a hill overlooking the battlefield, switched sides. Mitsunari had counted on Kobayakawa's support, had built his strategy around it. When those 15,000 troops descended the hill and crashed into the Western Army's flank instead of the Eastern Army's rear, the battle became a slaughter. Discipline collapsed. Units broke. What had been an army became a mob, and mobs do not win battles. The historical accounts become unclear here. Some sources claim Musashi participated in the siege of Fushimi Castle in July 1600, before the main battle. Others place him at the defense of Gifu Castle in August. A story exists, recorded by Tanji Hokin, though disputed by some historians, of Musashi climbing castle ramparts ahead of his unit, where a spear thrust through an arrow loophole caught him in the waist. Infuriated, he called down to the soldiers below, demonstrating how to deal with defenders by blocking the loophole with his own leg, waiting for the next thrust, then capturing the spear. Whether these accounts are literal truth or legend woven around a core of fact matters less than what they reveal.
Musashi fought with a recklessness that should have killed him. He took risks that professional warriors would not take. He survived when survival should have been impossible. When the Western forces broke at Sekigahara, those who could flee did. Tokugawa Ieyasu ordered the defeated hunted down. Being captured was not an option. It meant disgrace, torture, execution for oneself and one's family. Musashi disappeared into the mountains. For 4 years, history loses track of him. 4 years spent as a hunted man, a ronin without lord or protection, training in isolation on Mount Hiko, according to some traditions. Those 4 years forged something in him. They took the raw, aggressive fighter who had won duels through instinct and rage and refined him into something more dangerous. He had time to think, to analyze, to understand that true mastery required more than physical skill. It required strategy, psychology, the ability to fight not just with the body, but with the mind. When he emerged at age 20, he was no longer the boy who had been abandoned in Hirafuku. He was no longer the teenager who had survived Sekigahara through luck and instinct. He was becoming Miyamoto Musashi, and the decade ahead would write his name in blood across the length and breadth of Japan. Part 4. The Path of Blood. Dueling Years. In 1604, Musashi arrived in Kyoto. The capital was a city of culture, refinement, and carefully maintained appearances. It was also a city of warriors, schools of martial arts, and men whose reputations depended on never backing down from a challenge. Musashi, 20 years old and unknown, was about to make himself impossible to ignore. The Yoshioka school stood as one of Kyoto's most prestigious institutions. They had served as sword instructors to the Ashikaga shoguns. Their reputation was not just earned, but inherited, passed down through generations, like a family sword. They represented everything that traditional martial arts claimed to be: disciplined, refined, steeped in proper form and ancient wisdom. Musashi represented everything they despised. He had no formal training, no lineage to point to, no master whose name commanded respect. His techniques were improvised, brutal, effective. He fought to win, not to demonstrate proper form. When he challenged the Yoshioka school, they could not refuse without losing face. They also could not imagine losing to this crude, unkempt ronin, whose very presence was an insult to their carefully cultivated dignity. The first duel was against Yoshioka Seijiro, the school's head. Musashi employed a tactic that would become his signature. He arrived late, not by accident, but by design. While Seijiro waited at the appointed place, his mind running through the upcoming contest, preparing himself mentally, Musashi was elsewhere, deliberately absent. Time passed. The sun moved in the sky. Seijiro's certainty began to crack. Doubt crept in. Anger followed. When Musashi finally appeared, he was wearing what some witnesses described as shabby clothes, his hair unkempt, his bearing casual to the point of disrespect. Seijiro, already agitated by the delay, attacked with a fury that compromised his technique. The duel was brief. Musashi's wooden sword, he often fought with bokken rather than steel, caught Seijiro across the head with enough force to end the match. The Yoshioka master survived, but his pride did not. He retired from the school in disgrace. The second duel followed a similar pattern. Denshijiro, Seijiro's brother, stepped forward to restore family honor. Musashi again arrived late. Denshijiro again lost, this time fatally, though accounts vary on the exact circumstances of his death. What did not vary was the result. The Yoshioka school had now lost twice to the same opponent. This could not stand. But the Yoshioka family no longer approached the conflict as a matter of individual honor. It had become war. They arranged a third duel with Matashichiro, Seijiro's 13-year-old son. The boy would serve as bait. When Musashi arrived, he would face not one opponent, but the entire school. 60 students and followers, armed with swords, spears, bows, arrows, and even arquebuses. It was an ambush. It was murder, and Musashi walked directly into it. But this time, he arrived early. He positioned himself carefully, studying the ground, understanding that when facing multiple opponents, terrain mattered as much as technique. He waited in the rice fields near the designated meeting place, hidden, watching as the Yoshioka forces assembled with their young puppet at the center. Then, he attacked. What followed was not a duel. It was a slaughter. Musashi moved through the Yoshioka students like wind through wheat. He used two swords, a long katana and a short wakizashi, his hands moving independently, creating a web of steel that opponents could not penetrate. He killed Matashichiro first, removing the symbolic center of the ambush. Then he turned his attention to the others. The arquebuses fired and missed. Muskets of that era were notoriously inaccurate, especially when the target was moving unpredictably through uneven terrain. The arrows that found him did not strike true, glancing off or causing superficial wounds that he ignored. He waded through opponents, his blades writing sentences in blood, each stroke economical, each movement serving multiple purposes. The survivors fled. They had come expecting a massacre, planning to overwhelm one man through numbers. Instead, they learned that some men could not be overwhelmed, that skill and fury and absolute commitment could triumph over coordination and planning. They learned that Miyamoto Musashi was not just another ronin. He was a force of nature, wearing human skin. The Yoshioka school never recovered. Its prestige shattered that day in the rice fields, its students dead or scattered. Its reputation transformed from renowned institution to cautionary tale. But for Musashi, it was only the beginning. The next decade saw him travel the length and breadth of Japan, fighting duel after duel. The number varies by source. Musashi himself claimed over 60 fights by the time he turned 30. What remains consistent is that he never lost. Not once. Not ever. He developed a style that was uniquely his, the Niten Ichi Ryu, the two heavens as one school, based on wielding two swords simultaneously. This was revolutionary. Traditional samurai doctrine held that the katana should be wielded with both hands, that the wakizashi was merely a backup weapon. Musashi saw this as wasted potential. Both hands could strike, both blades could cut, and an opponent prepared to face one sword found himself facing two. His tactics went beyond technique. He understood that combat happened first in the mind. He studied his opponents, identified their psychological weaknesses, then exploited them ruthlessly. The delays, the deliberate disrespect, the unexpected approaches, all calculated to disturb the opponent's mental state. He would position himself so the sun was in his opponent's eyes. He would attack from unusual angles that disrupted their prepared responses. He threw dirt. He rammed opponents with his shoulder or hip, sending them sprawling. He used the environment as a weapon, luring enemies onto unstable ground or into positions where their own allies limited their movement. Some called it dishonorable. Musashi called it strategy. He was not fighting to demonstrate proper form or uphold abstract ideals of warrior conduct. He was fighting to win, and winning meant survival. The dead had no use for honor. The defeated could not appreciate refinement. What mattered was the outcome, and his outcome was always the same. He walked away, and his opponent did not. The duels became famous. Stories spread. Musashi's name grew until it preceded him like a shadow, and that shadow was long enough to darken entire provinces. Young warriors sought him out, hoping to make their own reputation by defeating the undefeated. Established masters challenged him to prove they were still relevant. He met them all, and he defeated them all, until the sheer weight of his record began to suffocate any hope of his defeat. But there was one name that still stood equal to his own. One warrior whose skill was said to match Musashi's, whose reputation was built on victories as consistent as Musashi's own. A man called Sasaki Kojiro, the demon of the western provinces, master of the Nodachi longsword, and creator of the Ganryu school. Their duel was inevitable. It would take place on April 13th, 1612, on a small island between Honshu and Kyushu, and it would become the most famous single combat in Japanese history.
Part 5. The Island of Destiny. Sasaki Kojiro was everything Musashi was not. Where Musashi was rough, Kojiro was refined. Where Musashi's reputation was built on brutality, Kojiro's was built on elegance. He wore the clothes of a kabuki actor, flamboyant and colorful, making himself impossible to miss. His sword was a nodachi, called the drying pole, over 3 feet long, 20 centimeters longer than a standard katana. He wielded this oversized weapon with a grace that seemed to defy physics. His signature technique, the tsubame gaeshi, the swallow cut, mimicked the unpredictable flight of birds. Kojiro had earned his position as weapons master to Lord Hosokawa Tadaoki, one of the most powerful daimyo in Kyushu. This was not a ceremonial title. Kojiro had fought, had won, had proven himself against the best warriors the region had to offer. When Musashi's challenge arrived, delivered through Nagaoka Sado, a trusted vassal of Lord Hosokawa, Kojiro accepted without hesitation. The time was set for 8 in the morning on April 13th, 1612. The place was Ganryujima, a small island in the strait between Honshu and Kyushu. Ganryujima measured barely 4 acres, a speck of land in the middle of water. Musashi chose it deliberately. Kojiro had many students, and if the duel went poorly for their master, those students might seek revenge. An island limited the options for interference. It also limited escape routes, which meant both warriors would have to commit fully. There would be no running, no calling for help, no external factors to blame. Just 2 men, and the question of who was truly better. Kojiro arrived at the appointed hour. He was immaculately groomed, his long hair tied back, his clothes perfect, his famous nodachi gleaming in the morning sun. He stood on the beach with Lord Hosokawa's officials, waiting for his opponent. The sun rose higher. 8 o'clock passed. 9 o'clock came and went. The morning stretched toward noon, and still Musashi did not appear. Kojiro's mental state began to shift. At first, there was only patience, the calm of a master swordsman preparing for combat. Then came confusion. Had Musashi forgotten? Impossible. Had he changed his mind? Unlikely. The confusion curdled into anger. This was disrespect, blatant and deliberate. Each passing minute felt like an insult, each hour a slap across the face. By the time Musashi's boat appeared on the horizon, 3 hours late, Kojiro was no longer calm. He was furious. His legendary composure compromised by 3 hours of waiting in the sun, 3 hours of mounting rage. Musashi had spent those 3 hours on a boat, being rowed to the island by a local fisherman. While Kojiro waited and steamed and fell apart, Musashi worked. He took an oar and carved it into a bokken, a wooden sword longer than his normal weapons. He knew Kojiro's nodachi gave the demon of the western provinces a reach advantage. The wooden sword, rough and unfinished, would match that reach. The weapon was crude, barely more than a shaped piece of wood, but in Musashi's hands, a shaped piece of wood was enough to kill. As the boat approached the beach, Musashi jumped into the knee-deep water and waded ashore. His appearance was everything Kojiro's was not. His hair was wild and unkempt, his clothes simple, his demeanor casual. He carried the oversized bokken over his shoulder like a peasant carrying a pole. He looked, to the gathered officials, like a man who had just woken from a nap and wandered onto the beach by accident. Kojiro saw red. He drew his nodachi and threw the scabbard aside, a gesture of finality. There would be no sheathing this blade until one of them was dead. Musashi saw the gesture and smiled. According to witnesses, he called out across the sand, "If you have no more use for your sheath, you are already dead." The words hit Kojiro like a physical blow. They were not just mockery, they were truth. A warrior who discarded his scabbard declared that he expected to win, that sheathing his sword would not be necessary. But in that certainty lay overconfidence, and overconfidence was a weakness that could be exploited. Musashi had already won the psychological battle. What remained was to make the physical outcome match. The 2 warriors approached each other. The beach fell silent. Even the water seemed to hold its breath. These were the 2 finest swordsmen in Japan, and everyone present understood they were witnessing history. Whatever happened in the next few seconds would be told and retold for centuries. Devam. Kojiro struck first. The swallow cut came like its namesake, fast and unpredictable, the nodachi whistling through the air in an arc that should have taken Musashi's head. But Musashi was already moving, his timing perfect, his distance calculated to the inch. The blade passed so close that it cut his headband. Some sources claim it drew a thin line of blood across his forehead, but it missed. Missed by a hair, but missed completely. Musashi's counter was immediate. The wooden sword came down on Kojiro's head with all the force of Musashi's training, all his experience, all the decades of refining technique until it transcended technique and became pure will. The impact was catastrophic. Kojiro went down, his skull fractured, his vision darkening, but the demon of the western provinces was not dead, not yet. With his last strength, he attempted a second cut, aiming for Musashi's legs, trying to take his opponent with him into death. Musashi stepped back, avoiding the desperate slash, then struck again. The bokken came down on Kojiro's chest, breaking ribs, stopping his heart. The greatest swordsman Musashi would ever face lay dead on the sand. The duel had lasted seconds. Years of training, decades of reputation, a lifetime of dedication to the sword, all decided in the time it takes to draw breath. Musashi stood over the body, breathing hard, his rough bokken still in his hands. The officials stepped forward to confirm what was obvious. Sasaki Kojiro was dead. Miyamoto Musashi had won. The island would be renamed Ganryu in Kojiro's honor, ensuring that the defeated warrior would be remembered as long as the island stood. Musashi bowed to the officials, returned to his boat, and was rowed away. No celebration, no triumph, just a man rowing away from the greatest victory of his life, carrying the knowledge that the opponent who had pushed him closest to death now lay still on an empty beach. After Ganryu Island, Musashi fought fewer duels. Some say he had reached his peak and knew it, understood that continuing to fight would eventually mean facing someone younger, faster, luckier. Others claim that Kojiro's death affected him more deeply than he admitted, that killing the one opponent who had truly challenged him left a void that more victories could not fill. The truth, as always with Musashi, was probably simpler. He had proven what he needed to prove, and further duels served no purpose. The question of who was Japan's greatest swordsman had been answered on a beach between two islands, answered permanently and with finality. Everything else was just repetition. Part 6. The Warrior's Twilight. The years after Ganryu Island saw Musashi's transformation from pure warrior to something more complex. The man who had lived by the sword began to understand that living only for combat was a form of death in itself, a narrowing of existence until nothing remained but steel and blood. In 1614, Japan found itself in conflict again. The Tokugawa shogunate, now firmly established, moved to eliminate the last vestige of opposition, the Toyotomi family, holed up in Osaka Castle. What followed was a siege that drew warriors from across Japan. Musashi participated, fighting under the banner of Mizuno Katsunari, a personal friend and trusted general of the Tokugawa forces. The siege lasted from winter 1614 into summer 1615, a grinding campaign that ended with Osaka Castle in flames and the Toyotomi line extinguished. By this time, Musashi was in his 30s. He had survived 3 decades of combat, had accumulated scars both visible and hidden, had watched countless opponents die by his hand. The young man who had killed Arima Kihei in a fit of rage was gone, replaced by someone who understood the cost of violence, who knew that every victory was also a defeat, that every life taken left a mark on the taker. Around 1623, Musashi adopted a son. Mikinosuke was the 3rd son of Nakagawa Shimonosuke, another vassal under Mizuno Katsunari. The adoption was partly strategic. Musashi had no blood heirs, and Japanese society of the era required some form of lineage to ensure one's legacy. But it was also personal. Musashi, who had been abandoned by his own father, chose to become a father himself. The man who had walked alone his entire life invited someone else onto that path. The years that followed were, by some accounts, the happiest of Musashi's life. He served as a retainer to Lord Ogasawara Tadazane, and later to Lord Tadatoki, the son of his former patron, Hosokawa Tadaoki. In Akashi, near modern-day Kobe, Musashi helped design the city's layout, applying strategic principles to urban planning. He taught his two-sword style to select students. He tended gardens, finding in the careful arrangement of rocks and plants a different kind of combat,
one where the enemy was chaos and the victory was harmony. Then, in the spring of 1626, Lord Tadatoki fell ill with tuberculosis. The disease consumed him over 3 months, and on a summer day, he died at age 30. The Lord's death triggered a tradition that would horrify modern sensibilities, but was considered proper and honorable at the time. Ritual suicide by key retainers. Mikinosuke, as Tadatoki's chief retainer, was bound by custom and honor to follow his lord in death. Musashi learned of his adopted son's obligation, while Mikinosuke was still traveling back from Edo. The young man stopped to visit his adoptive father one final time, to say goodbye, to receive whatever wisdom or comfort the legendary swordsman might offer. What words passed between them, history does not record. We know only that Mikinosuke continued his journey to Himeji Castle, where he performed seppuku, ritual disembowelment, with the precision expected of a samurai. The wound this death left in Musashi never healed. He had faced countless enemies, had stood in the center of battlefields where death reigned from every direction, had killed the finest warriors Japan could produce. None of it compared to the pain of watching his son walk calmly toward death, bound by honor to a tradition that allowed no escape. Musashi understood duty. He understood sacrifice. But understanding did not make it hurt less. He adopted another son after Mikinosuke's death, Iori, who would go on to serve Lord Hosokawa and eventually become chief retainer of the domain. But Musashi changed after 1626. The man who had been granite became something harder, colder, more remote. He trained his students, but kept emotional distance. He fulfilled his obligations to his patrons, but invested less of himself in relationships that could be torn away. He understood, with a clarity that came too late, the truth embedded in one of the Buddhist precepts he had learned as a child. Attachment is the source of suffering. In 1633, Musashi entered the service of Hosokawa Tadatoshi, the new lord of Kumamoto Castle in Kyushu. This would be his final patron, his last position in the world of samurai and domains and obligations. He was nearly 50 years old, an age that most warriors never reached. The dueling years were long behind him. The great battles had been fought and won or lost. What remained was the question that haunts every warrior who survives their profession. What now? For Musashi, the answer lay in transformation. The hands that had held swords began to hold brushes. The mind that had studied angles of attack began to study the flow of ink on paper. The body that had trained for decades in the art of death turned toward the arts of life. He did not abandon the warrior's path. That remained his foundation, the ground from which everything else grew. But he expanded that path until it encompassed more than combat, until the way of strategy became the way of life itself. Part 7. The Brush and the Blade. The first time Musashi held a calligraphy brush with the same focus he had once reserved for a sword, something shifted in the universe. Not in the physical world, but in the realm of understanding, in the space where discipline meets expression and produces art. Sumi-e, ink painting, was an ancient tradition in Japan, borrowed from China and refined over centuries. The technique was deceptively simple: black ink on white paper or silk, using a brush to create images that captured the essence of a subject rather than its exact appearance. A great Sumi-e painting said more with less, suggesting mountains with a few strokes, implying water with careful use of empty space, containing entire universes in the precise placement of a single brushstroke. For Musashi, the parallels to swordsmanship were immediate and profound. Both required absolute focus. Both demanded economy of motion. Wasted movement in combat meant death. Wasted brushstrokes meant ruined art. Both relied on reading the situation, understanding what the moment required, then executing with precision and commitment. And both transformed the practitioner, demanded that they become empty vessels through which technique flowed without thought, without hesitation, without the interference of ego. His most famous painting, The Shrike on a Withered Branch, demonstrated his mastery.
The piece showed a small bird perched on a bare branch, rendered in just a few confident strokes. But the bird's eye held something that made viewers uncomfortable in a way they could not quite articulate. It was watchful, alert, predatory. The branch was dead, winter-stripped, offering no shelter or comfort. The entire composition spoke of isolation, vigilance, the necessity of remaining aware even in emptiness. Art critics praised the economy of the brushwork. Warriors saw something deeper. They saw Musashi himself, perched alone, always watching, never at rest. Another painting showed Hote, the god of fortune and abundance, watching two roosters fight. The god's face held an intense concentration, the same quality of attention Musashi brought to combat. This was not casual observation, but complete presence, the gaze that missed nothing, that absorbed every detail and integrated it into understanding. The painting illustrated one of Musashi's core teachings: to see everything without focusing narrowly on anything, to hold the whole battle in your awareness, rather than fixating on a single opponent. In the Book of Five Rings, Musashi wrote, "When I apply the principle of strategy to the ways of different arts and crafts, I no longer have need for a teacher in any domain." This was not arrogance, but recognition of a deeper truth. Mastery in one discipline revealed the principles underlying all disciplines. The focus required for swordsmanship was the same focus required for painting. The patience needed to outlast an opponent was the patience needed to create art that would outlast the artist. The principles were universal. Only the applications differed. He became proficient in calligraphy, using the same principles. The characters he wrote had a quality that distinguished them from even skilled calligraphers: a directness, a lack of hesitation, a sense that each stroke was made with complete commitment. There was no revision in Musashi's calligraphy, no going back to correct or improve. Each character was written once, perfectly, or it was discarded and begun again. This was the mind of a swordsman applied to ink and paper. One cut, one kill, no second chances. Sculpture followed. He carved wood and worked metal, creating images of Buddhist deities and warriors. His Fudo Myo-o, the fierce protector deity, had the same quality as his paintings: a sense of watchful intensity, a readiness for violence held in perfect stillness. Those who viewed these sculptures reported feeling watched by them, as if the carved eyes followed viewers around rooms. But art was not separate from martial training. It was martial training expressed differently. When Musashi taught his students, he insisted they practice the tea ceremony, study calligraphy, learn to appreciate poetry. Not because these things made better fighters in a technical sense, but because they cultivated the qualities that combat required: focus, presence, appreciation of rhythm and timing, understanding of Ma, the concept of negative space, the emptiness that gave form to fullness. The tea ceremony in particular held lessons for warriors: the careful attention to each movement, the precise placement of utensils, the focus on being completely present for each moment. These were not distractions from martial training. They were martial training refined: combat against disorder and chaos, victory measured in harmony rather than blood. In his painting studio, Musashi discovered something that decades of dueling had not taught him: the possibility of creation rather than destruction. A sword could only cut, could only end. A brush could bring into being, could add to the world rather than subtract from it. This realization did not make him abandon the sword. He continued to train daily, to teach students, to refine the Niten Ichi-ryu style. But it expanded his understanding of what a warrior's life could contain. The paintings and calligraphy that survive from Musashi's later years speak to us across centuries, because they embody a truth that transcends time and culture. Mastery is mastery, regardless of domain. The same focus that made him undefeated in combat made his brushstrokes decisive and confident. The same awareness that allowed him to read opponents allowed him to see the essential nature of subjects and capture them with minimal means. The same discipline that drove him to practice sword forms until his hands bled drove him to pursue artistic excellence with equal intensity. When modern business executives study the Book of Five Rings, when martial artists analyze his techniques, when artists examine his paintings, they are all studying the same thing:
the mind of someone who pursued mastery with absolute commitment. The medium changes, sword or brush, combat or commerce, but the underlying principles remain constant. Focus, discipline, presence, adaptation. The courage to commit fully, knowing that hesitation means failure. The willingness to continue refining even after achievement. Understanding that the path has no destination, only the next step forward.
Musashi painted as he fought, with complete conviction, perfect timing, and an economy of motion that made the difficult appear effortless. His art was not decoration. It was demonstration. Proof that the way of strategy extended beyond the battlefield, that a warrior could wage war against ugliness and chaos using brushes instead of blades, that victory did not always require defeated opponents, only mastered techniques applied to willing canvas. Part 8. The Cave of Wisdom. In 1643, at nearly 60 years old, Musashi retreated from the world. He walked away from Kumamoto Castle, from his students, from the comfortable life of a respected guest of the Hosokawa clan. He walked southwest to Mount Iwato, to a cave called Reigando, the Spirit Rock Cave, and there, in solitude, he prepared to do something harder than defeating 60 opponents. He prepared to defeat time itself by writing his wisdom down. The cave was not comfortable. It was barely shelter, a natural hollow in the mountainside, exposed to wind and weather, offering nothing but space and isolation. There was no luxury here, no servants to bring meals, no students to massage his aging muscles. There was only stone and silence, cold at night and hot during the day, the kind of place that breaks men or transforms them, depending on their nature. Musashi had always been comfortable with discomfort. A lifetime of never bathing had trained him to ignore the body's complaints. Decades of sleeping on hard ground, eating whatever was available, enduring heat and cold without complaint. These had prepared him for this final solitude. But this was different. This was not endurance for its own sake. This was endurance in service of creation. He began writing The Book of Five Rings, the Gorin no Sho, in the autumn of 1643. The work would take him a year and a half, completed just days before his death. He divided it into 5 books, each named for an element from Buddhist philosophy: earth, water, fire, wind, and void. The structure itself was a teaching, a way of organizing combat principles according to natural phenomena, making the abstract concrete. The Earth Book laid the groundwork. Here, Musashi explained the basics of his Niten Ichi-ryu school, the philosophy behind two-sword fighting, the importance of understanding strategy as something broader than mere technique. He compared the way of strategy to being a master carpenter. Both required knowledge of tools, materials, and the ability to envision the completed work before beginning. A carpenter who focused only on hammering nails while ignoring the larger structure would build nothing lasting. A warrior who focused only on sword techniques while ignoring strategy would win nothing meaningful. The Water Book addressed flexibility and adaptation. Water takes the shape of its container, violent when falling from heights, gentle when flowing across plains, always finding the path of least resistance while remaining capable of tremendous force. This was how a warrior should approach combat, present and flowing, neither rigid nor weak, capable of responding to any situation without predetermined patterns. Fixed techniques were brittle. They broke against unexpected situations. True mastery lay in developing principles that applied everywhere, not memorizing movements that worked only under specific conditions. The Fire Book dealt with combat itself, timing, distance, rhythm, the actual application of technique to opponents. Musashi described not just how to strike, but when, not just what technique to use, but why. He explained how to perceive an opponent's intention before they acted, how to disrupt their rhythm, how to attack when they were mentally committed to defense, or defend when they believed you would attack. Combat was not about being stronger or faster. It was about being more aware, more present, more capable of reading the continuous flow of action and reaction. The Wind Book critiqued other schools. Musashi detailed their limitations, not from arrogance but from observation.
He noted schools that relied too heavily on the longsword, others that emphasized footwork to the detriment of upper body technique, still others that became so focused on proper form that they forgot the purpose of form was effectiveness. This book was Musashi's way of explaining that knowing your own path required understanding other paths, seeing their strengths and limitations, learning from their successes and failures. The final book, The Void, was the shortest and most profound. The void represented that which could not be taught directly, only realized through dedicated practice. It was the state of mind that transcended technique, where the sword moved without thought, where perception happened without processing, where action and reaction became simultaneous. Modern students might recognize this as the psychological state called flow, but Musashi understood it as something more, not just optimal performance, but liberation from the self, from fear, from the limitations that thinking imposed on doing. Throughout the Book of Five Rings, certain themes recurred. Musashi emphasized the importance of mastering multiple arts, not just swordsmanship. He insisted that a warrior must understand carpentry, writing, commerce, any discipline that revealed principles applicable to combat. He warned against becoming too attached to particular weapons or techniques, explaining that true mastery meant being equally effective with any tool or none at all. He stressed the psychological aspects of combat, the importance of disturbing an opponent's mental state, of perceiving weakness and exploiting it ruthlessly. But beyond technique, beyond strategy, the book contained something more personal, the distilled wisdom of a life lived entirely on the warrior's path. Every word was earned through experience, through duels that could have killed him, through battles where death surrounded him, through decades of refining skill until skill became art, and art became philosophy. As Musashi wrote, his body began to fail. 60 years of combat had taken their toll. Old injuries ached. Muscles that had once moved with liquid smoothness now protested motion. The hands that held the brush had been broken and healed multiple times, arthritis settling into joints like uninvited guests. But he continued writing, knowing that this work mattered more than any duel, that victory over time required capturing knowledge before it died with him. The cave where he worked became a kind of temple, though no one worshipped there but the old warrior himself. He sat in meditation for hours, contemplating principles, testing their truth against memory, refining language until each sentence carried maximum meaning with minimum words. The economy of his brushstrokes in painting translated into economy of language in writing. Nothing wasted, nothing excessive, everything necessary, nothing more. Outside, the seasons turned. Cherry blossoms bloomed and fell. Summer heat gave way to autumn cool. Winter came again, bringing snow to the mountain. Musashi noticed but did not pause. The work was not done, and until it was done, nothing else mattered. He was dying. He knew this with the certainty that comes from a lifetime of standing close to death.
But death would wait. It would have to wait until the last character was written, the last lesson recorded, the last breath of wisdom transferred from living memory to permanent text. When he finally completed the Book of Five Rings in early spring of 1645, Musashi was exhausted. Not just physically, though his body was failing rapidly, but there was the exhaustion that comes from pouring one's entire being into creation, from holding nothing back, from giving everything that remained to be given. The book was complete. His life's understanding of combat, strategy, and the warrior's path now existed independent of him. It would continue after he died, would teach students he would never meet, would influence battles he would never see, would transcend his mortality through the simple permanence of written text. But he was not finished. There was one more text to write, one final teaching to record. This one would be shorter, more direct, more personal. It would contain not the strategies for combat, but the principles for life. And it would be his goodbye. Part 9. The Final Teaching. 7 days before his death, Miyamoto Musashi took up his brush one last time. The work he had just completed, the Book of Five Rings, was comprehensive, detailed, a complete system for warriors who sought to walk the path of strategy. But it was not complete. There was something else that needed saying, something simpler and more difficult. The text he wrote in those final days consisted of 21 lines, just 21 sentences, each one a precept, a rule for living. He called it the Dokodo, the path of aloneness, or the way of walking alone. It was dedicated to Tarao Maganojo, his most devoted student, the one who would carry forward his teachings after death silenced the teacher. The precepts were stark, uncompromising, stripped of any softness or accommodation. They read like commands carved in stone. Accept everything just the way it is. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. Do not, under any circumstances, depend on a partial feeling. Think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world. Be detached from desire your whole life long. Each line was a knife edge of clarity, cutting away the comfortable illusions that most people wrapped around themselves. Musashi was not offering advice on how to be happy or successful in conventional terms. He was offering the distilled essence of what he had learned through decades of walking alone, of having no one to depend on but himself, of choosing a path so narrow that companions could not walk beside him. Do not regret what you have done. This precept carried weight when spoken by a man who had killed 60 opponents, who had stood over bodies knowing that each death was final, irreversible, permanent. Regret changed nothing. It was attachment to a past that could not be altered, a refusal to accept what was. The warrior who spent energy regretting yesterday had no energy for surviving today. Never be jealous. Jealousy was comparison, and comparison was poison. Each person walked their own path, faced their own battles, earned their own victories, or suffered their own defeats. To compare yourself to others was to ignore the fundamental truth that no two paths were identical, that what worked for one warrior might doom another. Never let yourself be saddened by a separation. This from a man who had watched his adopted son walk toward ritual suicide, who had been abandoned by his father, who had spent his entire life understanding that everything, every person, every position, every possession was temporary. Sadness over separation was attachment to continuity in a world where nothing continued unchanged. Resentment and complaint are appropriate neither for oneself nor others. This was perhaps the most ruthless precept. It acknowledged no right to bitterness, allowed no victim mentality, permitted no wallowing in grievance. The world was what it was. Complaining about it was as futile as complaining about rain or gravity. The warrior accepted circumstances and worked within them, or changed what could be changed, or died trying. But complaint served no purpose. Do not let yourself be guided by the feeling of lust or love. Here was the loneliness encoded in the title itself, the path of aloneness. Musashi had never married, had taken no long-term companion, had understood that romantic love was another form of attachment, another vulnerability that enemies could exploit. The path he walked required complete self-sufficiency, emotional as well as physical. Love was a distraction from the way. In all things have no preferences. Preference was rigidity disguised as taste. The warrior who preferred certain conditions, certain opponents, certain circumstances, was unprepared for all the times when conditions, opponents, and circumstances failed to match preferences. True mastery meant being equally effective in all situations, prepared for everything, attached to nothing. Be indifferent to where you live. Home was not a place but a state of being. The warrior carried his home with him, or, more accurately, understood that home was an illusion, a temporary arrangement that could be destroyed at any moment. To become attached to a location was to create vulnerability. Do not pursue the taste of good food. This from a man who had eaten whatever was available for 60 years, who understood that the body was a tool to be maintained, not a source of pleasure to be indulged. The pursuit of culinary excellence was the pursuit of dependence on something external, something that could be denied or used to control you. Do not hold on to possessions you no longer need. Musashi practiced this throughout his life. His possessions at death were minimal. His swords, a few writing implements, simple clothes. Everything else had been given away or abandoned. Possessions were anchors,
each one a reason to stop moving, to settle, to become predictable and vulnerable.
Do not act following customary beliefs. Convention was the enemy of adaptation. The warrior who fought according to customary beliefs faced the warrior who fought according to strategic necessity. The former lost because they were predictable, the latter won because they were not. This precept extended beyond combat to all of life. Think for yourself, test beliefs against reality, discard what does not serve truth, even if everyone around you insists on its validity. Do not collect weapons or practice with weapons beyond what is useful. Even weapons, the tools of his profession, were not to be fetishized or hoarded. A warrior needed effective weapons, maintained weapons, weapons he had practiced with until their use became extension of self. But collecting swords for their own sake, training with exotic weapons for the sake of variety, was distraction masquerading as dedication. Do not fear death. The final precept, the culmination of everything before it, fear of death was the root of all weakness, all hesitation, all failure. The warrior who feared death held back in combat, compromised his technique, allowed opponents openings that skill alone could not close. To walk the warrior's path required accepting death as inevitable, welcoming it even. Understanding that death gave meaning to life precisely because life was finite and irreplaceable. The Dokudo was not gentle. It offered no comfort, no reassurance, no suggestion that following these principles would lead to happiness, or peace, or any other conventional goal. It was the code of a man who had chosen to stand apart, to walk alone, to pursue mastery without compromise or accommodation. It was a path that most people could not walk, and would not want to, even if they could. But for those who read it centuries later, who found themselves resonating with its harsh clarity, who recognized something true in its refusal to soften reality, the Dokudo became more than a historical document. It became a mirror, showing them what absolute commitment looked like, what dedication without excuse resembled, what it meant to pursue a path with complete focus, regardless of cost. Musashi completed the Dokudo on May 12, 1645, by the old calendar. He gave it to Terao Magonojo 7 days before he died. With it, he gave the Book of 5 Rings, his completed life's work, the full expression of everything he had learned and understood. His students had instructions to burn both works. "There are no written works in my school," he reportedly said. But Terao and others recognized that some knowledge was too valuable to lose, that wisdom earned through such dedication deserved preservation, that future generations might benefit from understanding how one man had walked the warrior's path to its very end. The texts survived, they spread, they were copied, studied, debated, translated, and the man who had walked alone his entire life found, through death and the persistence of words, that he had been walking in company all along, the company of everyone who would read his work, who would try to understand his path, who would apply his principles to their own battles, whatever form those battles might take.
Part 10. The Last Breath. In the weeks following the completion of his final works, Musashi's health deteriorated rapidly. The body that had endured 6 decades of combat, that had survived wounds that should have been fatal, that had pushed through exhaustion and pain and deprivation without pause, finally reached the point where will alone could not sustain it. He stopped teaching. His students, who had grown accustomed to daily instruction in the Niten Ichi-ryu, found their lessons cancelled, their questions unanswered. Musashi withdrew to a small house outside Kumamoto Castle's walls, a final retreat from the world he had spent 60 years navigating. Those who saw him in those days spoke of a man who seemed already half departed, his attention turned inward, or perhaps beyond, focused on something visible only to him. But Musashi did not withdraw from discipline. Each morning, he still sat in meditation, his back straight despite the pain, his breathing measured despite the fluid gathering in his lungs. Each day, he performed the rituals he had maintained throughout his life, the care of his swords, the brief practice forms executed with diminished strength but undiminished precision. A warrior remained a warrior until death, and perhaps beyond. He gave away his few possessions methodically. The paintings went to students and patrons who had supported him. The calligraphy scrolls were distributed to temples and individuals who would appreciate them. His weapons, the tools that had defined his life, were given to those who had trained under him, each one a final lesson, a reminder that the blade itself mattered less than the hand and mind wielding it. To Tarao Maganojo, he gave the most important possessions, the Book of Five Rings and the Dokodo. The manuscripts were tied with simple cord, unadorned, their value residing in content rather than presentation. Musashi's instructions were brief. The texts should be shared with serious students, with those who genuinely sought to understand the way. They should not be displayed as curiosities or treasured as relics. They were meant to be used, studied, tested against experience. Knowledge that remained locked away was no knowledge at all. As his final days approached, Musashi requested armor. He wanted to die as he had lived, as a warrior. They brought him his yoroi, the traditional armor he had worn in battle decades earlier. The metal plates clinked softly as they settled over his emaciated frame, now too small to properly fill the armor's interior. But the symbolism mattered more than the fit. He was Miyamoto Musashi, undefeated in 60 duels, survivor of countless battles, creator of the two heavens as one school. He would meet death the way he had met every opponent, facing it directly, without fear or regret. On May 19th, 1645, according to some records, June 13th by the Western calendar according to others, Miyamoto Musashi drew his last breath. He died in meditation posture, back straight, eyes forward, hands resting in the position of one who had surrendered nothing to death, but simply acknowledged its arrival. Those present reported that his face held no trace of pain or fear. He looked, they said, like a man completing a long journey, satisfied that he had walked as far as the path extended. His body was buried at Yuji village, near Mount Iwato, as he had requested. They dressed him in full war armor, honoring his final wish, acknowledging that he had been a warrior until the last breath, that nothing, not age, not art, not philosophy, had ever replaced the fundamental identity he had forged in blood and steel decades earlier. As they lowered him into the earth, witnesses reported, a thunderstorm erupted from clear sky. Lightning split the heavens, thunder rolled across the mountains, and rain fell in torrents as if the sky itself mourned. The monks present saw it as a sign. The gods were welcoming one of their own, a warrior worthy of standing among them, a fighter who had never been defeated and never would be, not even by death itself. The next day, a stone memorial was erected near the burial site. It was called Mound Musashi, simple and direct, without excessive ornamentation or flowery epitaphs. The inscription acknowledged who was buried there, and when. It did not need to say more. The name itself was legend, and legends require no explanation, only remembrance. His students and adopted son, Iori, continued teaching the Niten Ichi Ryu, passing the techniques and principles from generation to generation. The books he wrote began to circulate, copied by hand, then eventually printed, then translated, spreading far beyond Japan to reach warriors and strategists and seekers across the world. The paintings he created were preserved in temples and private collections, each one a frozen moment of perfect execution, each brushstroke a lesson in economy and decisiveness. But more than the physical legacy, more than techniques or texts or art, Musashi left behind an example. He showed that mastery was possible, that dedication without compromise could achieve the seemingly impossible, that a man who began with nothing but will and discipline could reach heights that seemed reserved for gods or legends. He proved that genius was not divine gift but relentless practice, that skill was not innate but earned through 10,000 repetitions and 10,000 more after that. He also showed the cost of such mastery, the loneliness, the sacrifices, the relationships never formed, the comforts never enjoyed, the normal human experiences denied in service of a single-minded pursuit of perfection. His life was not balanced or well-rounded or any other comfortable phrase modern culture uses to describe optimal living. It was extreme, uncompromising, driven by a focus so intense it burned away everything extraneous until only the essential remained.
The man who died in 1645 had accomplished what he set out to do 60 years earlier, when a boy was abandoned in the mountains and decided that survival was non-negotiable. He had become the greatest swordsman Japan had ever produced. He had created an entirely new martial art. He had written texts that would be studied for centuries. He had mastered multiple arts and demonstrated that the principles of excellence transcended medium, that mastery in one domain opened doors to mastery in all domains, and he had walked the entire path alone, from the first step in Hirafuku to the last breath in Kumamoto, never asking permission, never seeking approval, never compromising his vision to accommodate others' expectations. The Path of Aloneness was not just the title of his final work, it was the story of his life, the price of his greatness, the choice he made every single day for 60 years.
Part 11. The Eternal Sword. The lightning that split the sky at Musashi's burial was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something larger than one man, one life, one century. The warrior who had walked alone in life found, in death, that he had never truly been alone at all. In the years immediately following his passing, the students he trained continued teaching the Niten Ichi Ryu. The two-sword style spread beyond Kumamoto, beyond Kyushu, eventually reaching every corner of Japan. Dojos dedicated to his method opened in cities where he had never set foot. Warriors who had never met him called themselves his students, learned his techniques from those who had studied under him, passed the knowledge forward like a flame that never dimmed. But Musashi's influence extended beyond martial arts. The books he wrote, particularly the Book of Five Rings, began a journey that would eventually circle the globe. In 1645, when he completed the text, it was a manual for samurai, a practical guide to combat and strategy relevant to a specific time and place. But the principles it contained proved universal. Strategy was strategy, whether applied to swordplay, battlefield command, business competition, or personal challenges. For 3 centuries, the book remained primarily a Japanese text, studied by martial artists and military strategists, its wisdom passed from generation to generation within the tradition. Then, in 1974, Victor Harris published the first English translation. The timing was significant. Western business was grappling with Japanese economic dominance, trying to understand how Japanese companies achieved such success. The Book of Five Rings offered answers, not because it was about business, but because principles of strategy transcended specific applications. Corporate executives began studying Musashi's teachings. They found relevance in his emphasis on understanding the terrain, on psychological warfare, on the importance of timing and rhythm. His warning against becoming too attached to particular weapons translated to advice about not being inflexibly committed to specific technologies or methods. His insistence on mastering multiple arts became a case for cross-functional expertise. His focus on perceiving the opponent's weaknesses mapped directly to competitive analysis. Business schools added the Book of Five Rings to curriculums alongside Sun Tzu's Art of War and Clausewitz's On War. Musashi became required reading for MBA students, his words analyzed in seminars and referenced in case studies. The warrior who had lived by killing opponents was now teaching people how to dominate markets and defeat business rivals. The principles remained the same, only the battlefield had changed. But beyond business, Musashi's influence seeped into broader culture. Martial artists worldwide studied his techniques, his philosophy, his approach to combat. The two-sword style he pioneered became iconic, instantly recognizable, imitated in countless films and stories. His undefeated record became legend. Not just good or successful, but 60 duels without a single loss. A perfect record that elevated him from historical figure to almost mythical status. In Japan, Musashi's cultural status approached canonization. He was declared a kensei, a sword saint, placing him in the rarest category of martial masters. The places associated with him became pilgrimage sites. Ganryu Island, where he fought Sasaki Kojiro, attracted visitors from across the world, all coming to stand on the beach where history's most famous duel took place. The Miyamoto Musashi Budokan was built in Ohara-cho, his birthplace, a training center dedicated to preserving and teaching his martial art. The cave where he wrote his final works became a tourist destination and meditation site. Popular culture embraced him. Novels fictionalized his life, most notably Eiji Yoshikawa's epic Musashi, which serialized in newspapers during the 1930s and later became one of Japan's best-selling books. The novel took significant liberties with historical fact, adding romantic relationships, dramatizing events, creating a narrative arc that served story rather than accuracy. But it introduced Musashi to millions who would never read the Book of Five Rings or practice the Niten Ichi-ryu, who knew him only as the romantic ideal of the wandering warrior philosopher. Films followed. Over 30 movies depicted Musashi's life, with actors like Toshiro Mifune bringing him to the screen in the 1950s, samurai trilogy, television series, anime, and manga added their interpretations. Each generation discovered Musashi anew, saw different aspects of his story as relevant to their time. To post-war Japan, he represented traditional values in a rapidly modernizing world.
To the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s, he was the ultimate individualist, walking his own path despite society's demands. To the corporate warriors of the 1980s, he was the exemplar of strategic thinking and competitive excellence. Video games made him a playable character, a boss to be defeated, a mentor to be learned from. The 2025 release of Ghost of Yotei included a character directly inspired by his Book of Five Rings, focusing on improvisation and finding every advantage in combat. Musashi had become more than a historical figure. He was an archetype, a template, a symbol of the warrior's path that transcended his own time and place. But perhaps the most significant aspect of his legacy was how his ideas continued to evolve and apply to new contexts. The Book of Five Rings, written for samurai who might face death in combat, found new life as a guide for anyone facing challenges. Its lessons about staying calm under pressure, about reading situations accurately, about adapting to changing circumstances, about the importance of continuous practice. These applied whether you were facing an opponent with a sword, or a difficult conversation with a supervisor, or a personal crisis that required strength to overcome. The Dokodo, with its stark precepts about living without attachment or regret, resonated with people seeking to simplify their lives, to escape the tyranny of constant consumption and comparison. Minimalists found in Musashi a philosophical ancestor, someone who had lived with almost nothing and achieved greatness precisely because he was not weighed down by possessions or dependence on external things. His art, the paintings and calligraphy that survived, became recognized masterpieces, valued not just for their creator's fame, but for their intrinsic quality. The economy of brushstrokes, the confidence of execution, the presence that emanated from even simple images, all demonstrated the mind of someone who had achieved true mastery. Art students studied his technique. Museums displayed his works. Collectors prized his pieces not as curiosities, but as genuine artistic achievements. The Niten Ichi-ryu continues to be taught in the 21st century. Instructors trace their lineage back through centuries to Musashi himself, each generation adding their understanding while maintaining the core principles. Students in Japan, America, Europe, and beyond practice the two-sword style. Learn the techniques Musashi developed. Try to embody the philosophy he lived. The school he founded has outlasted countless others, surviving because its foundation was not just technique but principle, not just movement but understanding. In academic circles, scholars debate details of his life, which battles he fought, which duels actually occurred, how much of the legend matches the history. But these debates, rather than diminishing his legacy, enrich it. They demonstrate that Musashi remains relevant enough to argue about, important enough to study seriously, significant enough that getting his story right matters centuries after his death. The lightning at his funeral proved prophetic. The gods had indeed welcomed a warrior worthy of standing among them. But they had done more than that. They had ensured that his spirit, his dedication, his principles, his uncompromising pursuit of mastery would continue echoing through time, teaching warriors who faced challenges Musashi could never have imagined, in battles fought with weapons he never held, achieving victories he never lived to see. Part 12. The Message Across Time. 4 centuries separate us from Miyamoto Musashi's last breath. Yet his presence remains, not as historical curiosity or nostalgic memory, but as living instruction, relevant wisdom, principles that refuse to become obsolete. Why does a 17th century Japanese swordsman still speak to the 21st century world with such clarity? Because he understood truths that transcend time, culture, and circumstance. Musashi teaches first about discipline. Not the discipline of punishment or restriction, but discipline as liberation. The understanding that consistent practice creates freedom. Every day, for decades, he trained. Not when he felt like it, not when conditions were ideal. Every single day, regardless of weather, mood, injury, or circumstance. This consistency compounded, each day's practice building on the previous, until skill became instinct, and instinct became art. Modern life offers endless excuses. Too busy, too tired, not the right time, lacking the right equipment. Musashi lived in caves, trained in snow, practiced when wounded. He had no excuses, because he did not accept excuses as valid. The difference between those who achieve mastery and those who only talk about it is simple. The former practice consistently, the latter practice when convenient. Convenience is the enemy of excellence. He teaches about strategy versus strength. In his duels, Musashi rarely won through superior physical power. He won through superior psychology, through understanding opponents better than they understood themselves, through exploiting weaknesses that were mental rather than physical. He arrived late to disrupt his opponent's mental state. He used weapons that countered their advantages. He fought at times and in places that favored his style over theirs. This lesson extends to all forms of competition. The competitor who relies only on direct strength, more effort, longer hours, greater resources, will eventually face someone stronger. But the competitor who uses strategy, who thinks deeper and acts smarter, who makes opponents fight on disadvantageous terms, wins even when physically outmatched. Strength is finite. Intelligence is force multiplier. Musashi teaches about the power of focus. His entire life demonstrated single-minded dedication to mastery. He did not dabble. He did not dilute his attention across multiple paths. He chose the way of strategy and walked it to its absolute end, eliminating everything that did not serve that purpose. No wife, no permanent home, no comfortable life, no easy pleasures, just the path. Walked daily, pursued relentlessly. The modern world celebrates the opposite: diversification, work-life balance, well-rounded development. These are not wrong, but they are not the path to mastery. Musashi shows that extreme achievement requires extreme focus, that greatness demands sacrifice, that you cannot have everything and be everything. You choose what matters most, then give it everything, accepting that other things will remain unchosen, unexperienced, unknown. He teaches about art and war as one. Musashi's mastery of painting and calligraphy was not hobby or distraction from his martial training. It was martial training expressed differently. The same focus that made his sword strokes decisive made his brush strokes confident. The same discipline that drove his combat training drove his artistic development. The principles were universal. Only the application changed. This integration challenges modern compartmentalization, the idea that we have separate selves for work and home, for serious pursuits and creative play. Musashi shows that excellence is a way of being, not a contextual performance. The focus, discipline, and presence that make you excellent in one domain make you excellent in all domains, if you apply them consistently. He teaches about psychological warfare. Musashi understood that most battles were won or lost in the mind before physical confrontation began. The opponent who arrived angry
fought poorly because anger disrupted technique. The opponent who arrived overconfident made mistakes because they underestimated challenges. The opponent who arrived afraid had already lost because fear created hesitation, and hesitation meant death. Modern competition, whether in business, sports, or personal challenges, operates on the same principles. The psychological dimension often matters more than the technical. Confidence without arrogance, calm under pressure, the ability to read opponents and situations accurately, the willingness to adapt when initial plans fail. These are Musashi's lessons, applied to contemporary contexts. He teaches about walking alone. The Dokodo, the path of aloneness, was not advice to be antisocial or isolated for its own sake. It was recognition that certain paths require walking alone, that some goals demand independence from others' opinions, expectations, and approval. Musashi understood that the warrior who depended on others' validation had given those others power over him, had created vulnerability where strength was required. In an age of social media metrics and viral validation, where success is measured in likes and follows, Musashi's insistence on walking alone is revolutionary. It suggests that true achievement comes from internal standards, from pursuing mastery for its own sake, from caring more about the quality of your work than others' reactions to it. The path walked alone is the path walked authentically, without compromise or performance. He teaches about facing death without fear. This lesson extends beyond literal combat. Every significant challenge contains a small death, death of comfort, death of certainty, death of the self that existed before the challenge. Those who fear these small deaths hesitate at crucial moments, hold back when commitment is required, compromise when dedication is needed. Musashi's absolute fearlessness in the face of death translated to absolute commitment in all things. He held nothing back because he understood that holding back guaranteed failure. The modern application is clear. Whatever you pursue seriously will require you to risk something. Reputation, resources, time, comfort, the possibility of failure. Those who cannot face these risks, who need guaranteed success before beginning, never begin at all. Musashi shows that courage is not absence of fear but action despite fear, that greatness requires risking everything on the outcome. He teaches about the price of mastery. Musashi's life was not easy or comfortable or balanced. It was extreme, demanding, often lonely. He sacrificed normal human experiences, love, family, comfort, security, in service of his chosen path. He offers no reassurance that this was the right choice, no guarantee that similar dedication will yield similar results. He simply shows what absolute commitment looks like, and lets each person decide if the cost is one they're willing to pay. This is perhaps his most honest teaching. Excellence demands sacrifice. Mastery requires cost. Greatness is not compatible with comfort. The modern desire to have it all, to achieve excellence while maintaining ease, is fundamentally incompatible with how mastery actually works. You choose what matters most, then give it everything, or you choose everything but excel at nothing. There is no third option. But perhaps Musashi's greatest teaching is simply existence proof. He demonstrated that mastery is possible, that dedication can achieve the seemingly impossible, that someone born with no advantages, abandoned, disfigured, without resources or connections, can through sheer will and relentless practice become the greatest at their chosen path. Every time someone doubts whether improvement is possible, whether dedication matters, whether practice pays off, Musashi's life answers, yes, if you commit absolutely. The man who lived 4 centuries ago in a country most modern people will never visit, practicing arts most will never study, facing challenges most will never encounter, remains immediately relevant because he embodied principles that transcend specifics: focus, discipline, strategic thinking, psychological awareness, integration of multiple skills, willingness to walk alone, courage to face death, commitment to continuous improvement, honesty about costs and requirements. These principles work because they are not culture-specific tactics, but fundamental truths about how excellence is achieved. Musashi discovered them in the context of swordsmanship and battlefield strategy, but they apply everywhere humans strive to excel. That is why he endures. That is why his books are still read, his paintings still studied, his techniques still practiced. Not because history is interesting or samurai are cool, but because he figured out how mastery works and wrote it down clearly enough that anyone willing to do the work can follow the same path. The message across time is simple. Mastery is possible, but it is not easy. Greatness is achievable, but it demands everything. Walk the path if you choose, but know that the path is narrow, lonely, and uncompromising. Walk it anyway if you must. Walk it because you must. Walk it until you can walk no further. That is what Musashi did. That is what he teaches. That is why 400 years later, his voice still echoes with undimmed clarity.
Part 13. Closing. The call to honor, the man they buried in the mountains of Kyushu with lightning crashing overhead, was not perfect. He was not divine. He made mistakes, hurt people, chose a path so narrow it excluded nearly everything that makes life comfortable or easy. But he was dedicated. He was focused. He was uncompromising in his pursuit of mastery. And for those qualities, he became immortal. You've heard his story now. You've walked with him, from abandonment in the mountains through 60 undefeated duels, from the chaos of war to the silence of the cave where he wrote his final wisdom. You've seen what absolute commitment looks like, what dedication without excuse produces, what walking alone with purpose means. His story does not offer comfort. It offers challenge. It does not promise that following his path will make you happy or successful by conventional measures. It promises only that dedication compounds, that discipline creates freedom, that mastery is possible for those willing to pay its price. Somewhere, right now, someone is facing a challenge that seems impossible. Someone is trying to achieve something that others call unrealistic. Someone is walking a path that friends and family don't understand, pursuing mastery in a field that offers no guarantees, risking everything on the possibility of becoming excellent at something that matters to them, even if it matters to no one else. That person is Musashi's true descendant, not through blood or formal lineage, but through shared understanding that some paths must be walked, that some challenges must be faced, that some standards must be met, regardless of difficulty or cost. If this story moved you, if Musashi's dedication resonates with something in your own spirit, if you recognize in his uncompromising focus a reflection of what you aspire to become, then honor that recognition. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, support the telling of these stories, because courage breeds courage, dedication inspires dedication, and legends live only as long as people remember them and carry them forward. But more than that, more than any like or subscription, honor Musashi's legacy by pursuing your own mastery with the same relentless focus. Find your sword, whatever form it takes. Practice your art, whatever medium you choose. Walk your path, however narrow it might be. Do it with the understanding that excellence demands everything and gives back only what you earn through 10,000 hours of dedicated practice. Because legends never die. They transform. They find new expression in each generation. New warriors carrying the same principles into new battles. New artists applying the same dedication to new media. New seekers walking the same path of aloneness toward the same destination of mastery. Miyamoto Musashi walked alone for 60 years, but he left a trail for others to follow. The lightning at his funeral was not an ending. It was a signal fire, burning across centuries, calling to every person who hears the story and recognizes something true in it, something worth pursuing regardless of cost. The path is still there. The principles still work. The challenge remains. Will you walk it?